Profit framework. So refer to your handout, and let me walk you through this. We'll go through the first framework. I'll give you some examples. Then we'll move on to the next framework, another demonstration. And so this is a good one to start because he's already seen a lot of it. Okay? And so the profit and profitability framework, it starts with profits. Profits comprised of revenues minus costs, and then it has these branches. And so I'll go through one branch at a time and show you what the common questions are and what you want to be doing as you go through that process. So if you have a profit problem, you want to figure out if it's revenue or cost driven. We showed you how to do that earlier. If it's revenue driven, you want to look at units sold versus revenue per unit. So price times volume, mathematically equals sales revenue. Okay? And usually, if they're kind, it's only one of the two problems. If they're unkind, it's like units shipped have dropped and prices have dropped. And then you're thinking like, that's a lousy business. Okay, well, once you sort of gotten down to this level, you're nowhere near done. Okay, so this is where I told you earlier, the opening of the case is very mechanical, identical, systematic every single time, and then beyond that, it starts becoming sort of situation dependent. Depends on what information you are given will drive what you do next. So let me give you sort of the rules of thumb. Within the branch, what you want to do, let's say it's a unit sold problem. Okay? What you want to do next is you want to actually isolate, segment and isolate. So that's the two bullets. Segment, isolate. Segment, segment, segment. Isolate mathematically, computationally, what's driving the bulk of the mathematical problem. Okay? So if it's a unit sold issue, you want to ask, what drives unit sold? I'd like to segment unit sold into its component parts. Do we have any information on the components that drive units sold? Okay? And you're looking for a segmentation. You're looking for, yes, in Europe, units sold are up 20%. In Asia, they're down 20%, that kind of thing. Sometimes a segmentation pattern. Again, the trick here is there are lots of ways to segment. Don't guess, ask them. Tell them you want to segment, and then open the door to let them tell you which way you ought to segment. Because usually they'll have one preferred way, and there's no interview value in having you go through like 15 ways you can segment. Because in a live consulting engagement, you'll be doing it plenty enough. You'll be looking at how to segment this way. There's no differentiation in the numbers. You segment a different way. There's no differentiation until you find the right way, and you break it up. Okay, it's a geographical problem, all right, or it's a channel problem. The internet channel is just sort of like growing like a weed, but face-to-face sales is dying. So the key is segment, and then isolate. When you've isolated, say, okay, this profitability problem is really being driven by the by a decline in sales volume in in the Southwest, something like that. Okay? And then the question, then usually you move on to the next framework, the business situation, understand why. Okay? I've also put here sort of common segmentation patterns. So by product line, by distribution channel, by region, by customer segment. So new customers, old customers, big customers, small customers, customers older than a year, less than a year, customers from certain verticals. So those are very common ones, and I don't think I've ever actually had the segment. I've just said I need the segment, and then they usually give me the data. Okay, so that's most common. Okay. So you want to basically drill down. If there's a dead end where clearly your hypothesis is wrong, you want to come back up the framework, go back to profit, and go down the other logical side. Okay, it's very common. So when I give interviews, I will oftentimes, if I know it's a revenue problem, I'll tell you to start with cost. Okay? And I want to see how long it takes you to figure it out. If you're good, you figure it out like in 3 minutes. Right? If you're not, you're sitting there like looking at cost. It makes no freaking difference because it's a revenue problem. Right? Okay, on the cost side, what you're looking for is you want to break down costs. So this is how I do it. Lots of ways to do it. But I've always broken down cost by units sold and then cost per unit. Okay? The other reason I do that is because then if I have to, if it's a complex problem where it's both sides of the branches are impacting profits, like prices are down and costs are up, then it's like, pain in the butt, right? Because you got to do both sides. But if you have cost per unit, it allows you to compare versus revenue per unit. So you can sort of analyze things at a micro level, not just sort of in the aggregate. So that's why I like looking at cost per unit. And then within cost per unit, I like breaking out fixed costs versus variable cost. And so you can either look at fixed costs and variable costs in aggregate or on a per unit basis. So it's a $20 product. Fixed costs could be $10 proportionally pro rata, or alloc when you sort of amortize it. And then variable costs could be the other $10. Okay, and then within fixed costs and variable costs, you want to further segment and keep drilling down until you figure out the one thing that's sort of driving the bulk of the problem. There's this rule that consultants use a lot called the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule, just for review, is it's finding what's driving the bulk of the problem. Okay? It's not mathematically complete, which drives people who like mathematical completeness a little bit nuts. But it's what's driving most of the problem. So if you find that profits are down, let's say by 10%, and 8% of that profit problem comes from cost, the consultant, you should say, well, geez, we could solve the whole problem, but let's really focus on cost because we nail that problem, we fixed 80% of the problem. And that's a good use of our time. Okay? All right. Okay, segmenting fixed costs and variable costs. Two different ways to do it. You can segment, basically the gist of it, you want to break it up into its pieces and in a way such that when you add all the pieces together, it equals the total. Okay? You can do it by value chain. So a value chain is all the parts of the business from sort of creation of product to it being sold to the customer. So you would look at fixed costs in raw materials, fixed costs in manufacturing, fixed costs in distribution, sales, and marketing, fixed costs in customer service. Okay? And if fixed costs have sort of gone up a lot, you want to know of those four parts of the business, where have fixed costs gone up the most? They might say it's manufacturing. Manufacturing costs have gone up by 20%, 40%. Overall costs have gone up by, I don't know, 10%. And since manufacturing cost happens to be, hope I'm doing my math right, about a quarter of the lower cost base, then it's really a manufacturing cost problem. Oh, okay, what's driving manufacturing costs? Let's look at the P&L. What are the components of manufacturing costs? There's labor, there's equipment, there's this, there's that. Turns out labor costs have gone up. Oh, interesting. I wonder why that is. Oh, there's a union negotiation going on, labor costs have gone up. Interesting, is that a company-specific issue, or is that a client issue? Right, so that's sort of how things evolve. You can look at variable costs the same way. You look at variable costs at each stage of the value chain. Sometimes the cost doesn't lend itself well to sort of within the value chain. So like, for example, once you've isolated that it's a manufacturing cost problem, sometimes you don't want to do it by first part of the factory, second part of the factory, third part of the factory. It's sort of not a logical way to do it. You might do it more around sort of line items in a P&L. Okay? But the general idea is, however you break it up, the total better, you add up the parts, to better equal the total. Okay? All right, and again, name of the game in this approach, particularly on profitability, it's all about problem isolation. It's all about problem isolation. See, if you half the battle, frankly, in consulting and in cases, is just figuring out what's actually wrong. Okay? And it's very confusing, you know, particularly when it's not just a profit problem. Like getting out into the marketplace, it's very, very confusing. I'll give you just an anecdote. So, I had a client I was working with for about a year, and they were in a business where like prices just like got slashed in half. 10 years ago, slashed in half, never recovered. Business is bleeding cash. Like, what happened? All right? And I could not for the life of me figure it out. Sort of no logical reason. I'm looking at all sort of like all pricing guides from all the competitors, and it was an industry problem, right? They all cut prices in half, you know, 10 years ago. Don't know why. And it took me like all the research and analysis, I could not figure out why. We ended up selling the business for like $1 billion. It was a divestiture. And I finally figured it out. What happened that year was the guy in charge of that business unit, his compensation plan changed. His bonus was huge based on units shipped, not on net profits, because the headquarters wanted to drive volume. So what did he do? He hacked prices in half, okay? Almost literally half. Moved a ton of volume, competitors followed, bled all the profitability out of that market. It never recovered. Span of 20 years, okay? Never recovered. And like conclusion, so-and-so screwed up, right? And that was what drove it. Not obvious. I mean, it took me a year until someone actually sort of said, nudge, nudge, look at the comp plan. I'm like, well, you don't see that every day. So that's why the isolation is important. Just because you know what's driving the problem, you don't always know the context. All right, what I want to do now is give a couple of variations on profits, and then we'll move on to the other cases. I'm spending a lot of time on this one just because it really does best. It's the simplest kind of case to sort of master. It best shows the logic and thought process. And if you sort of just drill this process into your head, you can apply it to situations where you have to make up the framework. Okay? And I've had to do that a couple times. So probably, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the time, there's like a case that doesn't fall into any sort of known category demand, right? And so then you have to sort of use the, that's interesting, I told you this morning. Really mean it. And start thinking out loud. It's like, gosh, this is a very interesting problem. You must have had a good time with this one, right? And I'm sitting there like, what the hell am I doing? Okay, so profitability. Let me demonstrate again the wrong way. The wrong way is all about jumping around. Okay, so you're saying it's it's particularly if it's a business you don't assume you know. Okay, don't assume you know. It's actually it can be very dangerous if, let's say, for example, like if you're on the cutting edge of internet stuff, okay, and you say, well, you would sort of you have prior knowledge. If you start using your prior knowledge, but they didn't want you to, guess who's wrong? One of the two of you, and it ain't the interviewer, right? So you want to get rid of that knowledge. When I give cases that are sort of based on sort of real companies, I'll use things like, you work for a fast food joint called Almost McDonald's, okay? And I sort of do that. I always put the word almost, because even though it sounds like it's McDonald's, don't assume it is. So don't assume just because you went there last time and they had a promotion on Big Macs, it's a pricing problem, right? So you got to ignore that. And what often happens is when you start using prior knowledge, you start ignoring the framework and you start jumping, okay? Because you happen to know that industry really well. Maybe you worked from that industry and you know it back of your hand. You have all the data in your head. But if you start jumping around, it's not what? It's not client friendly, right? Doesn't matter if you're right if clients can't follow. Okay? So an example is with ABC Company is, oh, I know ABC Company. Yeah, they're like the leader in like XYZ industry. Prices have been trashed in that business. It's clearly a pricing problem. Okay? Could be right, but it's relevant. Okay? You got to stick to the framework. All right, again, the reminder of the right way. Is you want to, again, open the case. We had this talked about this earlier. Stall, if you need it. Verify, understand the question, and then structure. So we opened the profitability framework earlier. Analyze the case, which will demonstrate. And then we talk about this. We haven't done this yet, but the conclusion and action recommendation. State what this all means. Okay? So particularly in McKinsey, we use a phrase called "so what." Okay? Sales are down, so what? Sales are down. Okay. Prices are down, so what? Okay. Prices are down because there's a new low-cost competitor in the marketplace with a very high fixed cost position, but extraordinarily low variable costs. Okay. Conclusion is the so what is you can't win this game anymore. You don't have low-cost position, variable cost position. The more volume they produce, because their variable cost is so low, the more profits they make, the worse you get off. You can't win this game. You got to exit this business. I'm making it up, right? But that would be a clear conclusion. So the question is always so what? So what? What does that mean? What do I do about it? And so you'll oftentimes hear people say that a lot. All right. So I actually have a question for you guys. I'm running a little behind. I can either sort of go through the profit framework more with a demo, or if you feel like you guys got it, I can start moving on to the other things. I'm totally flexible. Don't care. I'll do the profit framework. I'll skip a couple of the variations that I've already covered, and I will do.
Just do like maybe one.
Yeah, I'll do one on the cost side because I haven't done that a lot. So again, there are a lot of variations to profitability. We talked a little bit sort of about pricing and units sold. I'll give an example around on costs, particularly fixed versus variable, because there's some interesting relationships and patterns that you want to be aware of. So the case again would open like profits are down for ABC Company by 20%. Why? Revenues haven't changed. So it must be a cost problem. Costs are down 20%. The costs are up 20%, which is driving the profitability issue. And we're drawing all this out, which I should probably do. Actually, yeah, this will be a good idea, actually. Let me go back to I'll just use a new slide here. So I'm going to use slide B here, which you guys don't have. I'm just making a record for the video here. And I'll draw this thing out, and so you can kind of see how it visually looks. So we start off talking about profits on the decline by 20%. Revenues are flat at 0%. Costs have gone up by 20%. Okay? So it's cost-driven profit problem. Okay? Looking at units shipped.
Do they normally give straight numbers like that, or is it like 10% here, 10% there?
You know, well, actually, it often is just whatever happened in real life. So majority of the time, it tends to be like one of the two. If it's like both, it's a little more complicated because then you got to go figure out like what's the proportion. So if units shipped have declined and fixed and unit costs have gone up at the same time, then it's like, okay, which moved more? Okay, so and then you have to like write down your numbers because you get like a lot. I mean, in some cases I've had like 35 numbers, you know, and sometimes the numbers are useless, but they're giving it to you, so write it down so you can go back to it. And you might want to practice taking notes because you're in a stressful situation, you're jotting down numbers in an unfamiliar situation. You knew the number was given earlier, but you didn't label it. You wrote it down, which is good, but you don't remember what it means because you didn't label it. And you didn't label it on the board because you were used to doing it on paper. So those are all sort of important things. Units shipped, and then cost per unit. So I'm going to just say it's a cost per unit problem, even though mathematically it doesn't sort of tie out because I want to illustrate a particular point. And so for cost per unit, we want to break out into, let's say it's, it's $10 cost per unit. Then we want to look at fixed versus variable. And it could be that fixed cost is $8. Well, let's make it $2. And then the question is sort of what's changed the most. So the dialogue goes, cost per unit is at $10. It's gone up to $10 cost per unit, is what the interviewer said, or you say in response to the information the interviewer gives you. Next question then is, okay, to understand why cost per unit has sort of gone up so much, we need to break cost per unit into its component parts. I'd like to look at fixed costs and variable costs. And you draw that, like I just did. So draw that out and say, okay, do we have the information on how much fixed cost, what of the $10, how much of that's fixed cost versus variable cost? And that gives you information that fixed cost is say $2, variable cost is $8. And then the next question is, okay, again, compare to historicals and compare to industry. Okay, so okay, that's interesting. Of these two, what were they the year before? Okay. And so let's say, and again, the math doesn't tie out, but let's say last year, this was sort of today, last year, it was at $6. Okay, so variable costs have really gone up. Yes? I'll speak louder?
Can you move the slide up?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. That's a good idea. So variable costs have gone from $6 a unit to $8 a unit. Okay, that's interesting. So really, we're isolating the problem. It looks like it's clearly a variable cost problem. Fixed costs haven't changed much. Okay, why have variable costs gone up? Okay. So what I'd like to do now, and I'm sort of talking to you as the interview, is I'd like to segment out variable costs. Okay? And I got to make up an industry. So let's say it's, so what's a low fixed cost business with high variable cost? Services. Okay, well, we'll make it services. Now I'm going to make it manufacturing. So I'm going to expand out variable costs into its component parts for this manufacturing business. And I assume this business has raw materials. Am I correct? Yeah, you're right. There's raw materials. Great. And I'm not familiar with like widget manufacturing. After they get raw materials, do they do anything to it, or does it go right to the manufacturing plant? oh yeah, there's some transportation costs, but they sort of can lump that into manufacturing costs. Okay, great. So that's the next step in the process is manufacturing. Am I right? Yes, it is in fact right. Great. And then there's, after this manufacture, there's distribution costs. Is that correct? Yeah, there's distribution costs. And then there's like, customer service, let's say. Great. So out of the $8, where does the $8 come from? Okay. So I'm making numbers up again. The interviewer says, well, raw materials is $4, manufacturing is $1, cost of sales and marketing is $2, and customer service is $1. Okay, interesting. Of those four numbers, how have they each changed over the past year? It turns out there's been no change in manufacturing, variable cost, distribution, and customer service, and raw materials costs have gone up by whatever would be mathematically appropriate to match the number above, but I'll just put, say, a 20% increase. Okay. Great, interesting. So we have raw materials costs going up 20%, and look like when you do all the math, that's really driving the cost problem. I'm curious to know what the raw material costs for the competitors are relative to this particular company. Okay? So you might say, that's not a good framework for this, but this would be sort of like, company, other competitors. I would probably actually drawn on a clean sheet of paper. So look, because now we know what the problem is. It's like a new case. Okay? So actually I'll go ahead and do that. This is slide C, I think. So we have the competitors, the company, and manufacturing cost. So they were, I don't know, $3.25 last year, but now $4. Do we have information on the competitors? Turns out the raw material cost is the same, and it's identical. Okay, it's an industry issue. All right. So it's clear variable costs for raw materials have gone up for industry-wide. Now we don't know why. Okay? And then this would be like, well, now what we need to do is we need to understand the context of the industry that this company is in. So I'm going to sort of switch gears and look at the business, the market overall. And here I would probably switch to the business situation framework. I might use, and we haven't talked about that yet, but if you guys are familiar with Porter's 5 Forces, are you guys familiar with that? Okay. So Porter's 5 Forces is a good framework for sort of looking at an entire ecosystem or a chain of sort of from supplier to company to its customers and looking at power shifts in between. I don't actually personally use it. I sort of take those elements and incorporate in my other framework because it's one less thing to remember. But here it would be very reasonable to start looking at doing the Porter's 5 Forces or looking at a business situation. Either would be fine. And so that's sort of an example of how far you would typically get in a profitability type case. And then usually it's like you know the math, but you still don't know you don't have understanding as to why, and more importantly, you don't have enough information to tell the client what to do. Okay? And that's when I would typically switch over. Okay? So you can follow this same process. So back on slide B again. You see how there's this tree, and clearly I haven't practiced my penmanship in a long time. You see the tree, you're working down the tree, and you're trying to isolate the problem. Right? And that's half the battle. I don't know, but a lot of interviewees never get there. Okay? They never actually isolate what the problem is. And they spend their time sort of lost in all this, or they get confused on the math, and they get sort of onto a detour.